You know what's wild? How long you spent believing a lie. That was never yours to carry. That lie that whispered, "You're too emotional. You're too intense. You want too much. You care too deeply. You feel too strongly." But here's the truth you were never told. You weren't too much. They were too little, too unavailable, too unprepared, too unequipped, too afraid. And because they lacked the capacity, they made you question your worth. But today, something shifts. Today, something clicks into place. Today, you finally understand what your heart has been trying to tell you all along. You were never too much. You were simply too real for someone who lived their entire life behind emotional walls. And that's exactly where your power begins. You didn't break them. Your presence just broke their patterns. You didn't overwhelm them. Your honesty overwhelmed the lies they lived by. You didn't scare them. Your depth scared the parts of them they've spent years avoiding. They weren't running from you. They were running from themselves. You were just close enough to expose the truth. It wasn't your intensity. It was their emptiness. It wasn't your passion. It was their numbness. It wasn't your clarity. It was their confusion. It wasn't your vision. It was their blindness. It wasn't your heart. It was their fear. They didn't leave because you were too much. They left because staying with you would have required them to finally grow up. And they weren't ready for that. You are the kind of person who pays attention, who notices the shift in someone's tone, who hears the quiet in their voice, who feels the distance long before anything is said. You don't love halfway. You don't show up halfway. You don't feel halfway. You show up with your whole soul. And that will always intimidate someone who only knows how to live on the surface. That's why they mislabeled you. That's why they misjudged you. That's why they misunderstood you. Because someone who can't meet themselves can't meet you. Someone who avoids their own emotions won't know what to do with yours. Someone who fears depth will always accuse the ocean of being too deep. But the ocean is not the problem. The swimmer is unprepared. And that's exactly what happened with you. You've been told you're too sensitive. But do you know what sensitivity really is? Awareness, perception, connection, presence, truth. You pick up signals other people can't see. You sense feelings other people can't name. You understand emotions other people refuse to explore. That isn't a flaw. That's emotional intelligence. But emotional intelligence will always look like too much to someone who lives emotionally disconnected. You weren't asking for attention. You were asking for effort. You weren't asking for reassurance. You were asking for clarity. You weren't asking for perfection. You were asking for presence. You weren't asking them to change. You were asking them to show up. Those are not unreasonable requests. Those are the foundations of a real connection. But when someone is used to relationships where nothing is required of them, your standards look like demands. Your boundaries look like pressure. Your voice looks like conflict. Your needs look like threats. Not because you're wrong, but because they were never taught how to handle intimacy. So they made intimacy your fault. There, you're too much wasn't an assessment. It was an escape, a door, a shield, a convenient excuse. It was easier for them to blame you than admit they lacked the tools to meet you where you were. It was easier to call you emotional than admit they were emotionally absent. It was easier to call you intense than admit they were emotionally shallow. It was easier to say you're overwhelming than admit they were underdeveloped. So they labeled you with words that belonged to them, and you believed it because you didn't know the truth yet. But you do now. Let me tell you why you felt like too much. Because you were dealing with someone who lived their whole life in emotional survival mode. Someone who thought shutting down was safer than opening up. Someone who believed running was easier than communicating. Someone who felt vulnerable only when they were losing control. Someone who confused numbness with peace, distance with safety, silence with strength. How could someone like that ever meet a heart like yours? Of course, they thought you were too much. You were the first person who ever challenged their emotional laziness, the first person who ever held up a mirror to their insecurities, the first person who ever asked for something real instead of something convenient. That's not a flaw. That's courage. And courage always scares the unready. What they called too much was simply your willingness to feel, your willingness to speak, your willingness to be real, your willingness to love wholeheartedly, your willingness to take relationships seriously. That level of presence is intimidating to anyone who has only practiced absence. People who live disconnected always feel threatened by those who live deeply connected. But someone's fear is not your responsibility, and someone's emotional immaturity is not your burden. Here's the truth no one ever told you. Your depth is a filter. It doesn't push away the right people. It eliminates the wrong ones. Your intensity is a compass. It takes you away from the emotionally lazy and toward the emotionally awake. Your sensitivity is a superpower. It allows you to feel the difference between a connection and a distraction. Your emotional honesty is a gift. It reveals who is capable and who is pretending. None of that makes you too much. It makes you aligned. It makes you powerful. It makes you rare. It makes you real. And real will always scare the unready. But here's what matters most. The right person will never call you too much. The right person will breathe easier with you, not heavier. They will feel inspired by your depth, not afraid of it. They will feel safe in your honesty, not attacked by it. They will feel energized by your passion, not drained by it. They will feel grateful for your emotional clarity, not overwhelmed by it. They will meet you with the same depth, the same presence, the same intensity, the same emotional maturity you've been offering all along. And when that happens, when someone finally sees you, values you, meets you, you will look back at the people who said you were too much, and you will laugh gently because you'll realize they were never your match. They were your mirror. They were your lesson. They were your awakening. They never rejected you. They revealed themselves. And all they truly taught you was how much you deserve. You were never too much. Your heart was simply too expansive for someone who had only ever loved in fragments. Your soul was too bright for someone still hiding in their shadows. Your love was too honest for someone still living behind masks. Your vision was too clear for someone who feared seeing the truth. Your loyalty was too unwavering for someone who didn't trust themselves. You weren't too much. You were too awakened for someone still asleep. And one day soon, you will thank God they couldn't meet you because they didn't break you. They didn't define you. They didn't diminish you. They prepared you for someone who won't just handle you, but honor you, match you, choose you, and rise with you. You weren't too much. They were too little. And now you finally know the difference. There comes a point in your life when you stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and you start asking a far more accurate question. What parts of myself did I silence just to make someone else comfortable? Because that's what you did. Not out of weakness, but out of love, out of hope, out of loyalty, out of wanting something real with someone who only offered you a fraction of themselves. You dimmed the fire to match someone who was terrified of heat. You softened your truth to protect someone who wasn't ready for honesty. You lowered your expectations to accommodate someone who couldn't rise to meet them. And each time you did, you didn't lose them. You lost yourself. Not fully, but enough to feel the ache, enough to feel the misalignment, enough to feel the emotional debt. You kept paying for someone who never invested in you, and still, you questioned your worth. But here's the revelation you needed. It wasn't your depth. That broke the connection. It was their unwillingness to show up with anything real. You weren't difficult. You were devoted. You weren't demanding. You were intentional. You weren't clingy. You were connected. And do you know what emotionally unavailable people do? When they meet someone who loves with intention, they panic because your love shines a light on their emptiness. Your consistency highlights their instability. Your openness reveals their walls. Being loved by you is like standing in front of a mirror they've spent their whole life avoiding. It's not you they fear, it's the parts of themselves they don't want to meet. Think back to all the moments you felt like you were too much. Those weren't moments of you being excessive. They were moments of you being alive. The nights you wanted communication weren't desperation, they were connection. The times you brought up real issues weren't drama, they were responsibility. The days you held them accountable weren't attack, they were maturity. The moments you wanted clarity weren't pressure, they were honesty. None of that was too much. It was simply too much. For someone incapable of depth, there's a difference. And once you see it, you'll never unsee it. You've been conditioned to shrink around people who never learned how to grow. You've been conditioned to apologize for your emotions because you were surrounded by people who couldn't handle their own. You've been conditioned to silence your needs because you were around people who expected connection without contribution. But that conditioning ends now because now you understand something vital. You cannot make someone deeper by becoming smaller. You cannot make someone ready by lowering yourself. You cannot make someone capable by dimming your soul. That's not love. That's self-abandonment. And you've abandoned yourself enough. Here's the hardest truth about being someone with emotional depth. You attract people who are drawn to your warmth, but terrified of the fire required to stay close. They want the light, but not the responsibility. They want the comfort, but not the accountability. They want the feeling, but not the commitment. They want to be chosen, but don't know how to choose. They want your heart, but don't know how to respect it. They want your presence, but don't know how to show up for you. So instead of admitting their fear, they make you the problem. Too emotional, too sensitive, too intense, too much. But those are not real criticisms. They're confessions. Confessions of their limitations. Confessions of their fears. Confessions of their emotional immaturity. They didn't reject you. They revealed themselves. Let's be honest. You gave chances. Long after they showed you their capacity, you gave understanding. Long after they stopped giving effort, you gave loyalty. Long after they treated you as optional, you gave them access that they didn't earn, didn't value, didn't protect. You kept showing up, hoping they would meet you halfway, but they never did. Not because you weren't worth it, but because they couldn't. Some people are not capable of the love you're capable of giving, not because they're bad people, but because they haven't met themselves yet. And you can't meet someone where they refuse to go. There was a version of you that believed that if you just tried harder, gave more, communicated better, loved deeper, they would finally understand your heart. But the problem was never your effort. It was their emptiness. You can pour oceans into someone who is emotionally bottomless, and they will still say, you didn't give enough. Not because you lacked effort, but because they lack capacity. You cannot fill someone who leaks. Healing begins the moment you realize that you were loving someone who couldn't meet you, not because you weren't lovable, but because they weren't ready for real love. Not because you weren't enough, but because they were too little for the depth you bring. Once you understand that, you stop chasing closure from someone who doesn't even have closure with themselves. You stop seeking validation from someone who can't validate their own emotions. You stop asking for apologies from someone who doesn't know how to be accountable. You stop waiting for clarity from someone who hides from clarity. Everything you needed required emotional maturity, and that's exactly what they lacked. But here's where your power rises. Their inability to love you does not diminish your ability to love. Their failure to meet you does not mean your standards are too high. Their emotional avoidance does not make your emotional depth excessive. Their unreadiness does not make your readiness too much. Let me say that again. Their unreadiness does not make your readiness too much. It simply means you were aligned for a relationship they couldn't handle. And you deserve someone whose capacity matches your heart. Imagine this: someone who doesn't flinch at your intensity, someone who doesn't shrink when you express your feelings, someone who doesn't retreat when things get real, someone who doesn't get overwhelmed by your honesty, someone who doesn't treat communication like conflict, someone who meets you with the same emotional presence you've always brought to the table, someone who sees your sensitivity as a strength, not a burden, someone who sees your depth as a treasure, not a problem, someone who sees your passion as alignment, not pressure. That person exists, and you will never find them as long as you keep shrinking to fit the emotional limits of someone who was never your match. You weren't too much, but you were too much for someone who was operating from emotional scarcity. You weren't overwhelming, but you overwhelmed someone who only knew relationships based on avoidance. You weren't intense. You simply demanded presence, and presence terrifies people who've spent their entire lives running from themselves. Here is the truth your heart has been waiting to hear. You were never supposed to stay in relationships where you felt like too much, because any room that requires you to shrink is not a room designed for you. Any person who requires your silence to feel comfortable is not aligned with your destiny. Any connection that needs you to dim in order to survive is a connection that is not meant to grow. You were always meant to outgrow them. And that's exactly what you're doing now. There is a version of you emerging now, a version that no longer apologizes for the way your heart was built, a version that no longer accepts crumbs just to feel chosen, a version that no longer lowers standards to keep someone in your life, a version that no longer confuses chemistry with compatibility, a version that no longer wastes years on people who can't meet you emotionally, a version that finally, fully understands you weren't too much, they were too little, and you will never again let someone too little convince you to shrink your soul. And here's the truth you've avoided for years. You weren't too emotional. You were emotionally alive. You weren't too deep. You were finally willing to feel. You weren't too intense. You simply loved with your whole soul. And the people who told you otherwise, they weren't capable of meeting you. Not at that level. Not in that depth. Not in the place where real intimacy lives. They wanted the watered-down version of you. The easy version. The quiet version. The version who didn't ask for effort. The version who didn't ask for honesty. The version who didn't ask for presence. They wanted convenience. You wanted connection. They wanted comfort. You wanted truth. They wanted someone who wouldn't challenge them. You wanted someone who would grow with you. That's the mismatch. Not that you were too much, but that they were operating from emotional scarcity, while you were showing up with emotional abundance. There's a difference, a big one. And you spent so long apologizing for how deeply you feel because someone with a shallow heart couldn't hold what you carried. You reduced yourself, softened yourself, muted yourself, edited yourself, just to make it easier for them to stay. But here's the part you need to hear. When someone with an underdeveloped emotional capacity meets someone with a rich internal world, they don't see beauty. They see pressure. Not because you're overwhelming, but because they can't stretch. Not because you're too demanding, but because they can't rise. Not because you expect too much, but because they expect too little from themselves. You became too much, only in the eyes of someone who had too little to offer. And how many times did you shrink your needs just so you wouldn't be left? How many times did you silence the part of you that wanted closeness, connection, certainty, reassurance? How many times did you pretend you were fine when you were drowning inside, all because you were afraid that your full heart would scare them away? But here's something powerful. Your heart didn't scare them. Their lack of capacity scared them. Your depth exposed their emptiness. Your clarity exposed their confusion. Your emotional courage exposed their avoidance. You didn't make them feel inadequate. Their own limitations did. But instead of facing themselves, they blamed you. They blamed your intensity, your passion, your honesty, your vulnerability, your desire to be understood. And because you loved them, you believed them, you internalized their fear as your flaw. You accepted their emotional failure as your too much. But here's the truth you've earned, and it will set you free. You were never too much, not for the right person, because the right person won't be intimidated by your heart. They'll be inspired by it. They won't call your needs needy. They'll call them human. They won't see your sensitivity as a burden. They'll see it as a gift. They won't see your emotional depth as chaos. They'll see it as richness. They won't tell you to calm down. Tone it down. Bring it down. They'll meet you there, at your depth, at your truth, at your level of emotional maturity. Because the right person doesn't need you to shrink. They need you, exactly as you are. But let's go even deeper. People who tell you that you're too much are almost always people who lack emotional awareness, emotional accountability, and emotional resilience. They see your honesty as confrontation because they're used to avoidance. They see your affection as pressure because they're used to distance. They see your vulnerability as risk because they're used to hiding. They see your desire for clarity as a demand because they've never learned how to show up consistently. You weren't too much. Your emotional maturity just revealed their emotional immaturity. And that's not your fault. And it's not your responsibility to fix. You've spent years trying to fit into spaces that were never built for you, trying to be digestible to people who were not ready for someone real, trying to hold together connections with people who didn't even know how to hold themselves, trying to prove your worth to someone who didn't even know how to value their own heart. You exhausted yourself, trying to stay small, trying to stay acceptable, trying to stay easy. But here's the beautiful truth. Your soul was never meant to be small. You were built for depth. You were built for connection. You were built for emotional truth. And yes, that means not everyone will be able to love you. Not because you're too much, but because you're not for everyone. You are for the person who doesn't flinch at your intensity, who doesn't run from your depth, who doesn't shrink from your truth. You are for the person who recognizes your heart, because they have one too, who sees your emotional depth as sacred, who sees your sensitivity as connection, who sees your vulnerability as beauty, who sees your needs as things they want to meet, not things they feel pressured by. You were never too much. You were simply too real for someone who wasn't ready to face themselves. And when you understand that, something powerful happens. You stop apologizing for being the way you are. You stop blaming yourself for the way they couldn't show up. You stop carrying the weight of someone else's emotional limitations. You stop contorting yourself into a version that feels safe for others, but suffocating for you. This is the moment you return to yourself, your full self, your emotional self, your intuitive self, your expressive self, your unapologetically sensitive self. This is the moment you reclaim the parts of you you thought you had to hide. This is the moment you realize something life-altering. You weren't too much. They were too little. And thank God they were, because it forced you to finally meet yourself. And when you meet yourself fully, you stop accepting half-loves, half-efforts, half-presence, half-relationships. You become aligned with people who can meet you the way you deserve. People who understand your depth because they have depth. People who understand your intensity because they feel intensely too. People who understand your sensitivity because they don't see it as a flaw. They see it as truth. Your emotional depth is not an inconvenience. It's your gift, your compass, your superpower. And the person who's meant for you will never ask you to dim it. There comes a moment in every healing journey when you realize you didn't break yourself trying to be loved. You broke the illusion that someone else's limits meant something about your worth. This is that moment, the moment when everything shifts, the moment when you finally see that the people who called you too much never actually saw you at all. They only saw the version of you they felt comfortable handling. They saw the parts they had the capacity for. They saw the pieces they were emotionally equipped to meet, but they never saw the full picture. They never stepped into your world deep enough to understand its beauty. And yet you spent years thinking the problem was you. But the truth is, they were never capable of loving someone like you. Not because you were unlovable, but because they lacked the emotional bandwidth to love in the way you needed. Some hearts are oceans. Some hearts are puddles. You were an ocean. They were a puddle. And puddles cannot hold oceans. But here's what you must understand. Your depth doesn't become less valuable just because someone couldn't swim. Your capacity for love doesn't become too much just because someone else wasn't ready to receive it. Your sensitivity doesn't become a flaw just because someone else wasn't emotionally literate enough to understand it. Your intensity doesn't become overwhelming just because someone else was used to superficial connections. You were showing up authentically. They were showing up defensively. You were transparent. They were guarded. You were emotionally available. They were emotionally underdeveloped. That's not compatibility. That's misalignment. And you can't fix misalignment by diminishing yourself. But you tried. And that's what hurt the most. You dimmed your fire just to make them feel warm. You lowered your standards just to make them feel comfortable. You toned down your truth because you didn't want to scare them. You diluted your passion because you didn't want to overwhelm them. You silenced your voice because you didn't want to lose them. But here's the thing. You lost yourself in the process, and now you're reclaiming every piece you gave away, every part you hid, every truth you swallowed, every feeling you suppressed, every instinct you abandoned. You're taking it all back because this time you're done making yourself small just to fit inside someone else's limits. This time, you choose you, and choosing yourself does something powerful. It resets everything. It changes who you attract. It changes what you tolerate. It changes how you respond. It changes the way you show up. Because once you reconnect with your full self, you no longer settle For half-love, you no longer negotiate your emotional needs. You no longer apologize for your sensitivity. You no longer shrink yourself to protect someone else's ego. You no longer soften your intuition to avoid their discomfort. Choosing yourself is not selfish. It's self-respect. It's self-trust, self-recognition, self-returning. It's the moment your soul stops whispering and starts standing tall. It's the moment you stop asking to be understood by people who refuse to listen. It's the moment you stop trying to be chosen by people who never even chose themselves. It's the moment you stop begging for the bare minimum, because now you see that your worth was never the problem. Their capacity was. Your depth was never the problem. Their fear of depth was. Your desire for connection was never the problem. Their avoidance of connection was. Your emotional truth was never the problem. Their emotional denial was. You were never too much. You were simply more than they were capable of holding. But here's what happens. When you finally step into your power, you attract people whose hearts match yours. People who aren't intimidated by your depth. People who aren't overwhelmed by your authenticity. People who aren't afraid of emotional intimacy. People who want to meet you exactly where you are. People who see your sensitivity as strength. People who see your vulnerability as courage. People who value the richness of your inner world because they have one too. These are your people, the ones who don't want you to tone down your passion, the ones who don't ask you to mute your feelings, the ones who welcome your depth because it mirrors their own. When you choose yourself, you raise the floor of what you will accept, and something magical happens. Your energy shifts, your relationships shift, your entire world shifts. You stop accepting crumbs because you finally understand. You were meant for the whole table. And here's the part you need to hear most. The right person will love the very things you were once ashamed of. Your intensity will feel like home to them. Your passion will feel like alignment. Your honesty will feel like safety. Your sensitivity will feel like connection. Your emotional depth will feel like truth. You will no longer be too much. You will finally be just enough for the person who can actually meet you. But before that person arrives, there is one more transformation that must happen. You must stop seeing yourself through the eyes of the people who never deserved you. You must stop carrying the judgments of emotionally unavailable hearts. You must stop believing that their limits were your flaws. You must stop defining yourself by the people who were incapable of holding you. Your story doesn't end with the ones who couldn't love you well. Your story begins with the moment you realize you don't have to prove your worth to anyone who isn't ready for you. Your enoughness is not up for negotiation. Your emotional depth is not a liability. Your sensitivity is not an inconvenience. Your passion is not a burden. You are not too much. You are a full spectrum soul in a world full of people still afraid of their own shadows. And the right person will rise to meet you. They will not run. They will not shrink. They will not get intimidated by your truth. They will show up. They will hold space. They will listen. They will understand. They will reciprocate. They will appreciate. They will cherish. And it won't feel like work. It won't feel like convincing. It won't feel like effort. It won't feel like anxiety. It will feel like alignment. It will feel like clarity. It will feel like peace. It will feel like recognition. Because they will see you the way you've always deserved to be seen. Fully, completely, without shrinking, without hiding, without apology. But the first person who must see you that way is you. You must become the one who stops abandoning yourself. You must become the one who stops dimming your light. You must become the one who stops turning down your volume to keep others comfortable. You must become the one who stands in your full truth, even when others cannot handle it. Because once you do that, once you fully choose yourself, your entire world expands. The people who cannot meet you will fall away naturally. The people who resonate with your depth will gravitate toward you, and the love you attract next will match the level you've risen to. A love that isn't scared of you, a love that isn't confused about you, a love that doesn't shrink from you, a love that doesn't ask you to be less, a love that honors you, meets you, expands with you. But until that arrives, remember this: you weren't too much, they were too little, and now you're finally becoming everything you were meant to be, without apology,